So once you've decided on a focus for an evaluation research design, there's still important decisions that have to be made about how to design the specific evaluation project. So questions like, do we want quantitative or qualitative data? Which methods are going to give us the most useful answers? Do we want black box or program theory? So do we care about why the program works, or do we just care that it works? And do we want researcher or stakeholder whose goals are more important, researchers or stakeholders? And do we want simple or complex outcomes? So how many outcomes and which ones are the ones that we're actually interested in? So we're going to go into each one of those in detail. So starting with quantitative or qualitative methods. So the type of method is going to depend on the specific question. It's going to depend on the population that you're interested in. It's going to depend on the stakeholders. So typically quantitative methods are used for evaluating really large programs, diverse target populations. You need the numbers to really be able to talk about populations like that. Often it's used for testing programs or policies that are already in place, which is why you have such large numbers for your population. Because if you're just starting out something new, you're probably going to start it with a smaller group. So typically, if it's a program that's already in place, is going to be where you're going to see large programs that have lots of people already engaged. Most often it's used in evaluation research, so most often quantitative methods are used in evaluation research. So typically you want to see those numbers, and stakeholders love to see numbers. So anybody that's putting money into the project, they want to see the numbers that show it works. So typically quantitative methods tend to be used more often. But qualitative methods can be used for evaluating really small or specific programs, or programs that we don't really know a lot about, which again are probably going to be on a smaller scale that we're starting them off with. So this kind of is where you would use these methods if you want to add really depth and detail, it can help you determine how the program is actually operating, how different people perceive it. Maybe the numbers show that it's working, but everybody in it is miserable. That's important. So the qualitative sort of adds that depth of information so you can know a little bit more about it. But you have to have a smaller population if that's the kind of methods that you want to use. So black box evaluation, so this is what we're looking at, whether we want to kind of know why it works or whether it just works. A black box evaluation just is about, is the program producing the desired outcome, yes or no? So it doesn't address the process that the effect was, that produced the effect. It's like, we don't care why, we just want to know, did it work, yes or no? So this is very common in outcome and impact evaluations. And I put the picture of the ostrich because it's like, don't care, I only want to see what I want to see. I don't care about the rest. So head in our sand sort of situation. So black box evaluation, it kind of sounds like bad that you don't care why it's working, but often people they don't care why it's working. If it's working, great, we're going to keep doing it. They don't care why. Big thing for non-researcher people, your typical people that are just, putting money into a program, or they're overseeing programs, and they just feel like, let's keep the ones that work, let's not keep the ones that don't work. They don't care why. So that's just very common in our impact evaluations and outcome evaluations. But the theory-driven evaluation is sort of where we do care. It uses theory to determine the model as to how the program is supposed to affect cases. Is it working the way that it's supposed to work, and did we expect this, and why should it work, and maybe why doesn't it work? So we don't just care that the program works, we want to know why. That's a big part of theory-driven evaluation, is to explain the process and explain why it's having the effects that it's having. So evaluation is designed to measure how well each piece of the theory is implemented. So whatever theory you're using, it's about, well, how well is it addressed, and how well is it shown the relationship and whatnot within this particular program. So you can identify, what needs work and what's doing well. It's based on the processes observed, but also the outcomes that are produced. So it's about not just that final outcome, but it's about, well, how is everything working together, and at what point are we, losing effectiveness or efficiency, and at what point is it increasing, and why is that happening, and we need to be able to explain it in order to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of it. So very much, if you want to really, if you're caring about more than just the final outcome, this is the kind of design you want to use if you care about why it works or it doesn't. So then we can look at whether we want a stakeholder approach or sort of a more science researcher kind of approach. So the stakeholder approach is where the research question is typically set by whoever's sponsoring the program, whoever is dishing out the dough, or typically it'll be a government agency, especially within CJ. It's often government agencies that are sort of behind a lot of the programs that are in place. And so they're responsible for the program. So they're going to say, well, here's what we want you to research and here's what we want you to evaluate. It encourages researchers to be really responsive to program stakeholders. So it's about being able to justify everything you're doing and be able to tell them, here's why we need to keep doing this, the way we're doing this, or here's why we need to change it. And so it's about knowing that you're going to be accountable to those stakeholders. And so stakeholders can be involved. They can be involved during the design of the project. So how are we going to implement this? Then also the implementation itself. So, who's getting it? How many people? How long are we running it? How are we assessing it? And then also the reporting stage at the end. So how well did it work? How efficient and effective was it? So stakeholders can be involved at any or all of those stages. It really depends on their own involvement, how many stakeholders you have, what they look like, how distant are they? Are they just some governing body that's doling out grant funding, or are they engaged? That can change sort of how much they want to be engaged. But the stakeholder approach is the idea of you're answering to the stakeholders, and they're the ones that are setting what you should be doing and sort of how you should be doing it and what they care about. But you could also have the researcher approach or the social science approach. And this is emphasizing the researcher's expertise, and they are saying like we know what we're doing, we have training specifically in this, we're going to ask these questions because these are the important questions. And they're going to maintain that autonomy to increase trust and also decrease bias. So if you take this approach, it's that sort of stakeholders are hands off, they're still providing the funding and the resources, but they're saying, but you evaluate it as you would because you are the expert in this area. And so then it increases trust, but it's also about like seeing, well, if it's showing it's effective, it's because it's effective. It's not because the stakeholders want it to look like it's effective. It's because it actually is. And so taking this approach makes that sort of more on the surface. And so, you're not hiding anything, or even you don't even have the appearance of hiding anything just because the people with the money are running it. So from this approach, then, you're going to derive program theory from the information on how the program operates, but also the social science theory or knowledge. And everything is coming from theory, from background, from experience. It's not coming from the stakeholders. And in totally goal-free evaluation, you don't even know the stakeholders' program goals. Not always the case, but in this kind of situation, it'd be where, we don't know what they're trying to reduce with this program. We don't know if this program is addressing violence. We don't know if it's addressing alcoholism. We don't know if it's addressing anger issues. We don't know. We're just going to implement it and see what it has an effect on. And so it's almost like a totally blind study where you're saying, well, we're just going to see what effects it has, and then we'll tell you, but we don't know what your hypotheses or what your hopes are from the beginning. So that's sort of an interesting way, but you don't typically have that disconnect. Typically, everybody knows what the goal is, but there are some cases where you could just be totally goal-free. So when you compare the stakeholder and the social sciences approaches, so if the stakeholders are ignored, you don't want to totally ignore the stakeholders because participants may become uncooperative because they don't think that the people who are important are part of it. So to them, maybe that you're not listening to these people that gave you the money, so why should I listen to you? So participants sometimes become uncooperative. Reports may be unused. If you ignore the stakeholders and you tell them about things that they didn't really care about, then they're not going to use those reports in any way, and basically they're just going to end up in the garbage. And so that's not helpful either. Then that information is going nowhere. And then, of course, the next project may not be funded. If you've ignored the stakeholders and they're like, well, you didn't do what we wanted you to do. You didn't do what we thought you were going to do, so we're not going to fund your research anymore. So you don't want to totally ignore the stakeholders. But you also don't want to totally neglect the social science procedures either, because then you may have, you may compromise the standards of evidence, which you don't want to do that because you want to make sure that everything you find is valid and reliable. And so then those conclusions about the program effects, you don't want to affect the validity of those either. So it's about not just in terms of how you're evaluating the research, and making sure that it follows all the standards it's supposed to, but also the final results and the conclusions, they have to still be valid. Otherwise, what's the point? And then if it's not valid, then the results may not be generalizable. So if you're doing things and you're not following the rules and you're just, choosing samples without making sure that they are either totally random or proportionate and things like that. If you're just like, oh, you want to do this, come on and do this, and you're not going to have generalizable results if you don't follow the rules of how good research is done. So you don't want to ignore the stakeholders, but you also don't want to totally neglect social science procedures either. So what you want then typically is a more integrative approach. So you want to balance the responsiveness to stakeholders and all of their concerns and everything that they're focused on. You want to balance that with your commitment to being objective, being scientifically trustworthy, being able to generalize your results. You want a balance there. And so you have to make sure that you're sort of doing both to have a really good evaluation research study. So the emphasis then changes at different stages of evaluation, typically if you have this integrative approach. So when you're taking into account these multiple values, being sensitive to the perspectives of different stakeholders, while also maintaining your commitment, then this means that typically the stakeholders are part of planning and design. So they're part of, here's what we were interested in, here's kind of what we want you to look at, here's the people that we think that this works best with, or that we want to see it work with. So they're going to be part of that. Then you look at the preliminary results would be given to the stakeholders to see if they suggest any changes, but the specific design would come from the researchers. And so then they would say, well, here's sort of what we're finding, just preliminary results. What do you think? Is this kind of what you're interested in? Then they maybe suggest changes, or maybe say, yeah, that's good. We want to see it now with a larger group. But then once the actual evaluation begins, the researchers regain that autonomy. So they're like, okay, so this is what we're going to do. You have told us what you want us to do. You've said we're on the right track. Now you're going to back off and we're going to do our thing. We're going to evaluate this. And then we're going to come back to you with the final results once it's done. Whether they're evaluating the program as it's going, or its effectiveness, or its efficiency, or whatever type of evaluation they're doing, the researchers become autonomous at that point once it starts. So that's kind of the best way to have that integrative approach, because then the stakeholders feel heard, they are part of the process, they are getting what they want out of it, but it's also going to be valid results, and you're going to have followed the proper research techniques and things like that. So that's kind of the best way to keep everybody happy, basically. So then the last thing to sort of think about is whether you want simple or complex outcomes. So are you measuring a single outcome? So you're just focused on whether it reduces, recidivism for property offenders in terms of property crimes. That's what you're interested in. Or are you interested in multiple outcomes? Maybe you're interested in whether a certain program reduces all kinds of recidivism, but also, violence in general, and, alcohol or drug-related crimes, or, you have multiple things that you're covering. So a single outcome may look at, may miss how the program is working, or may miss some secondary outcome that's actually coming from it, which may be good or bad. So if you look at a single outcome, for example, if a program doesn't directly reduce recidivism rates, but it reduces the severity of the crimes committed, so maybe because of increased self-control, let's say, then isn't that still a desirable outcome? And so you wouldn't know that if you only determined, just pure survival rates in the community, so whether people would go back to prison or not, it's like a yes-no, or if you just looked at how many offenders recidivated. So a single outcome is going to miss that. But then when you look at multiple outcomes, and it complicates things. It greatly complicates both the analyses, but also the interpretation of those numbers. But then the result usually is a much more realistic and richer understanding of the program's impact. But not always. If you can't get a good picture, then you can't get a good analysis of whether the program is having its intended impact or not. So you want to, again, balance. You want to make sure you're addressing everything, but you can't take on too much. So there's a balance there.